how are you feeling about the deal? I have to ask you, the deal that the House GOP caucus struck to get the after the Supreme Court hearings happened and the verdicts came down. What's your just 50,000-foot view of how well that deal went for the GOP?
Yeah, I could spend a lot of time getting into a lot of detail about it. I don't think I will. All I'll say is that it's the best possible resolution to the scenario with all things considered.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's like when you have a tie in one chamber and you're behind by one vote in the Senate and you have a Democrat governor, your ability to get your way drops dramatically. You can deny them their way. So, I mean, the trifecta is dead. The days of jamming down ridiculous progressive legislation are dead.
Correct.
But when people come and say, hey, it's time to get tough,
right?
It's hard to tell some of these people that this was tough.
Absolutely.
That's about as tough as you can get without breaking the rule of law and storming the Capitol with pitchforks and torches.
Yeah, this is what tough looks like.
Yes.
We stood together as 67 strong through this entire process. We showed up every day and to get to work.
Yep.
We had pushback from the Supreme Court, which overturned a bedrock principle of good governance. That was an absurd ruling that we frankly didn't expect.
Yeah.
And then we kept coming back, and we come back with the recall elections, come back with the attempts to compel by fining people their legislative pay and what have you. And eventually it got us into this position where the pressure was so high on them that they've had to figure out a way to come back. And their struggle was to find a sustainable narrative or a plausible narrative to give them some sort of cover and save some sort of face to justify why they had been out for 3 weeks. And of course, all of that is a big lie in terms of what they've been saying. And
I want to talk about what you can do in your position here as a not a majority, but tied in the Minnesota House for temporary majority, long term for the rest of the session, probably possibly the biennium. You're going to be tied, but let's talk a little bit about this idea that the Republican Party, especially the House caucus, needs to get tougher. I mean, you were tough, but there is a faction in operating in Minnesota politics that seems to have the Minnesota gun rights point of view that if you just take out enough Republicans, somehow the party will get tougher. You know who I'm talking about. I know him. The audience largely knows who I'm talking about. Many of them will disagree with me, but this is the road to Palookaville. I mean, there is no way forward for the Minnesota GOP getting tough and not winning races.
Well, it's tough in what context and by what standard, right? So I think the mistake that people make is that they think that individual toughness somehow wins elections or gets legislation passed.
Yeah.
We are a team. We are a caucus of 67. If you're talking about a chain, every single link has to be equally tough and in abidance with the other links in the chain. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
And what you have coming from, I regard as fake grassroots groups because they're not actually grassroots. Right. You know who the grassroots are?
Yeah.
The Republican Party of Minnesota exists for the purpose of electing people to office.
Yeah.
Anyone who is successful in that endeavor becomes an elected official.
Yep.
So by the nature of how the process works, your elected officials are your grassroots candidates. That's how they got elected.
Exactly. I want to come back to this as we land the plane later on in the segment because this ties into something I've been trying to beat into people's heads for literally. I had it beat into my own head 15 years ago, and I've been trying to pay it forward to the rest of the other activists here shortly here. But let's talk right now about the areas where the GOP can get tough on the people who matter.
Right.
The DFL. You're on the fraud committee, and that. We have another 4 weeks of majority, at least of a sorts here, with the speaker and the committees pretty much running our way. Let's talk about the fraud committee. What are you seeing? What do you expect to see during the time when we have some daylight here?
Well, it's shaping up to be an incredible tool for shedding light into the dark corners of what I would call the Democrat nonprofit industrial complex, right? So we had our first committee hearing this past week. We're going to meet again this Monday. We talked with the Office of Legislative Auditor and revisited this report that they came out with a couple of years back that just detailed what they call pervasive noncompliance with grant management practices.
I was going to call it looting, but yeah.
Sure. And basically what that means is that our grant process in this state has basically been operating on the honor system.
Yeah.
Where the state hands out money to whoever and just trusts that they're going to do what they say.
So much in parallel with what's going on in D.C. with the Doge.
Yes.
And of course, we can't have a Minnesota Doge until we have a Republican governor and at very least control of one of the chambers here, which we'll come back to shortly here. But I mean, the most alarming thing you found so far. I mean, it's something that people need to have their hair blown back by here so far.
Well, look, I mean, we're up to $660 million in confirmed fraud.
Yeah.
That's pretty alarming. I will say that there are things that will come to light. We have whistleblowers who are contacting our members of this committee and who are sitting down with us, had an hour-long conversation with a few of them yesterday. Wow. And the things that they are telling us will blow your mind. And when the time is right, they'll be disclosed. I
am looking forward to seeing this. By the way, some of the people who were let's just say advocating for toughness were saying, why didn't you guys hold out for subpoena power? I mean, I have one hunch, but what's with the lack of subpoena power?
Literally every legislative committee has subpoena power. So I don't know what people are talking about.
Okay, fair enough. The other, that's kind of what I thought. The other thing is, if you got enough whistleblowers, you don't need to subpoena whistleblowers. They're coming out voluntarily.
Right. Well, and the other part is that the lack of cooperation speaks volumes, right? Like you request to speak to a state agency or their representatives or a particular nonprofit, and you say, we want to talk to these people and ask them questions, and they say no, and they're evasive, or they plead the fifth, or whatever it is that they do. That tells you that there's something there that they don't want you to see.
Absolutely. So, so we'll be looking forward to seeing this next several weeks of hearings from the Fraud Committee. And by all means, if there's something we need to keep our eyes on, just have your people call my people, because this is the stuff I've been waiting for right now here. And until, it's as good as it's going to get until we get majorities in at least one chamber here, and until we have some visibility into the executive branch. That's of course where the bodies are really buried in all these issues here. So let's talk about the need to start winning elections. You made a point here. I used to say, why doesn't the Republican Party get tougher on issues like gun control, on abortion, on markets, on all these things? And a very wise member of the GOP staff took me out for lunch and said, Mitch, dummy, the party doesn't do policy. The party supports candidates. It's the jobs of the candidates and the people who caucus for them and get them elected and move them up the food chain from caucus to convention to convention to convention to office that actually do the policy. You want a good policy? It's your job to show up at caucus night and show up at those boring conventions and get the people who support your policies elected. And there are groups that understand that better than others. Right. And we need a whole lot of actual work-a-daddy, hug-a-mommy conservatives to understand that. And that's, I think, the big mission over this next year and a half here, is to make sure we have people who can, let's just say, overwhelm those who have been diluting the power of the Republican brand this last few years, Walter.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because, as Republicans, we all like to talk about the Constitution and the rule of law and proper government practices and structures. None of that tends to be acknowledged by some of these folks who are engaged in the process. They think that if they elect one really good person, then that's going to change the world. You are not electing a king. Yeah. You are electing one of, in the House, 134 state representatives. You need 68 of them to agree on something in order to pass legislation. And then you need the Senate to go along with it. And you need a governor who's going to go along with it in order for it to become law. That's the constitutional process. And so our politics and our approach to gaining power for the purpose of securing policy that is in alignment with our values has to acknowledge how that process actually works. If it doesn't, then you're just engaged in playtime.
And I said this in as many words on this show probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, but really, if you want to save the future of the Minnesota GOP, it doesn't rely with some pressure group. It doesn't even rely on the legislators themselves. It relies on you getting out and making sure that you have people who reflect your values, who can get elected in your district, wherever that is. I'm in the Midway, so it's probably going to be someone exceptionally moderate, but someone who's going to join that caucus is going to have to win their vote, and as opposed to putting out performative chanting points that look noble and go down to defeat.
Well, and look, performance is part of politics. Sure. I'm going to acknowledge that, but it has to be purposeful performance, right? Like
Yes.
Performance that helps the team reach the end zone.
Yeah. We have a lot of people on our side who are, at least rhetorically, the equivalent of, let me pull a name out of the recent past, Amber Moom.
Yeah.
Who believe that the idea of walking into the halls of government with a bullhorn, literal or metaphorical, is going to drive policy in the direction you want. It certainly ain't going to work for the Republicans. Getting out there and getting in people's faces just creates nastier enemies, as Amber Boom found at the point of your camera phone, which, by the way, is pretty brilliant stuff. Walter.
Yeah. Well, and look, I don't think, obviously, politics is an inherently antagonistic process. Confrontation is always going to be part of the picture.
Sure.
But you need to ensure you don't just fire wildly in any random direction.
Exactly.
You have a target, you have a strategy, you take into consideration the battlefield and the timing. Like no person would respect a sports commentator whose prescription for every down was a Hail Mary.
I think it's a pretty good plan. We should be able to pull it off this time. What do you think, Abdul? Can you give me a number crunch real quick?
Yeah, give me a sec. I'm coming up with 32.33, repeating, of course, percentage of survival.
Oh, that's a lot better than we usually do.
All right, thumbs up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Jenkins!
Oh my god, he just ran in. Save him!
Oh, geez, stick to the plane.
Oh, Jesus. Let's go. Stick to the plan, Shove.
Stick to the plane.
Oh, gee. Oh, fuck. Give me divine intervention. Hurry up.
Shout.
He's saying I can't cast. I can't move. Am I lagging, guys? I can't move. What the hell? I can't hear you. Oh, my God. The eggs keep responding. More responding. I don't think you can cast with that shit. Oh, my God. Shout.
We got it.
I got it. Take it off.
Come on, stay down.
Oh, my God.
I mean, the fact that we have a tie and a temporary lead gives us something we haven't had in 2 years, and that is the ability to quash all the bad things that have been coming through the legislature the last 2 years. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at.
No, it is a tremendous victory that we should all be proud of.
Yes.
And it's one of those deals. I used to work in private security back in my early adulthood. Yeah. And the thing about that industry or that field is that you never get credit for the things that don't happen.
Right.
You only get guff for the things that do, right? Like the expectation is that nothing bad should happen.
Yep.
And there's a principle there that applies to our current situation where you're not the only way you're going to know what things we prevented by breaking the trifecta is by looking at the bill introductions from the Democrats that don't end up advancing through the process and becoming law. Yeah. So all the crazy stuff that somebody like Lee Finke is introducing this year or will introduce this year, none of those things are going to end up passing because there isn't a single Republican who's going to vote for them. Yeah. That is huge, and we should be very thankful for that.
I mean, this stuff is all going to die and rot in committee, and that's exactly what we've been needing to see for this last 2 years. Very different from what we had before. So, obviously, the election of Curtis Johnson and the subsequent ejection of Curtis Johnson in 40B opened up a huge opportunity here, and obviously we want to see Paul Wickstrom win this race. I know the GOP's been turning out the troops to campaign for Wickstrom this last few weeks here. It's a long shot, but it's less of a long shot than some of the other specials we've had here. But the gift that has been for the Republican Party has been,
Well, yeah, and it's all born out of their tremendous arrogance, right? So Ryan Winkler was on a podcast disclosing his knowledge that Jamie Becker-Finn, who was the previous incumbent in that district, was well aware of the fact that Curtis Johnson, didn't live in the district. And the reason why they went forward with it anyway is because they've developed such a calcified sense of arrogance. They really do believe that they own this state and can get away with anything. And by the way, that's reflected in the fraud conversation that we were having last segment, right?
Yep.
A lot of this fraud, the brazenness of feeding our future. I mean, remember, that organization sued MDE, the Department of Education, for not paying them fast enough to commit more fraud.
That's right.
Like, that's how brazen and shameless they were about it. That sense of arrogance drove them to cheat in an election. They got caught, and now we find ourselves in this majority situation. And by the way, everybody talks like it's a predetermined conclusion that we're going to go back to a tie. It is not a predetermined conclusion. Yep. This special is winnable. It's all about turnout. I'm going to be out door knocking talking in that district tomorrow.
Yep.
Folks are fundraising. Folks are knocking doors. And there's a very real chance that we can maintain this majority.
Wickstrom, apparently, from what I hear, had a pretty amazing run of fundraising earlier on in this campaign. For a Republican in Ramsey County, unheard of amount of fundraising. There is hope. And if you live in that district, I mean, it is about the turnout. There's no excuse. Get out and vote in the special on March 11th there. Some of the DFLers did not get the memo that the winds have changed just a tad.
Yes.
You posted some video from the Public Safety Committee this past week that was absolutely hilarious. Breon Curran.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah, there were so many moments and you can go back and look at my X posts and stream and see many of them. I posted as much as I could.
Yeah.
But the one that was like just the top of the heap in terms of absurdity was there was a provision in one of our bills to increase penalties for people who trespass upon or do damage to critical infrastructure. So things like pipelines and what have you, which has happened. And we had a testifier who went in detail talking about the level of, and it really is organized crime. I mean, you're talking about like RICO style crime here. In targeting this critical infrastructure. And the response to that from Breon Curran was to say, well, maybe we should punish the people who stole land and ran pipes through it. So in other words, and one of the testifiers talked about, quote, so-called Minnesota, unquote, being on stolen land. And this is their whole thing. So they've learned nothing. They're still running with their most radical, crazy element in their party who thinks that Minnesota doesn't belong to Minnesotans.
Berg's 21st law in full effect. So Abshir Omar is joining us after this here, and this brings up an interesting point. A group of Muslim leaders endorsed Trump, and too late to have much of an effect in the last election here. But there's a bit of a sea change going on in the composition of the politics, and Republicans need to be aware of and take advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it was too late. I think it has not been properly acknowledged and leveraged by the folks who need to acknowledge and leverage it.
Fair enough.
The energy is there. Like the iron is hot, and now is the time to strike. Yeah. And there are two things, I think, primarily that are going to determine Republican success in Minnesota in 2026. One is the cohesion of our coalition around winning. Yeah. Like if not just unity for the sake of unity, not fighting about this policy or that, but cohesion around the goal of winning, of gaining majorities, of winning statewide. And the second thing is expanding our constituencies. And Abshir Omar is a tremendous example of that happening. Former Democrat operative, is now a Republican, and has done tremendous work in building that outreach into the Somali and Muslim communities.
And that's a good chunk of the reason we're having him on. We want to supercharge that to the extent we can here. That's one of the advantages that DFL has, and something that the GOP does that is both a blessing and a curse. The chair of the Minnesota Republican Party is there to facilitate, almost never gets in and rolls up his sleeves and smacks heads around to get the results he wants, whereas Ken Martin was far from above using his power and his fundraising and his superdelegate process and to get the result he wanted, which is why we didn't have Margaret Anderson Kelleher running for governor here. The DFL can do that. The GOP needs someone to grab the five families, if you will. I love my Godfather references, drag them into a room together. So until we actually start winning elections, all of this is just wind in sails unless you're a consultant or a grifter of one form or another. Is there some chance we can get the five families to maybe focus on the prize, the actual prize here for an election cycle? Walter Hudson.
Well, I mean, ultimately what we need is we need people to get involved in the Republican Party process who are serious people whose priority is professionalism and competence when it comes to winning elections for the purpose of securing public policy. Anything other than that needs to be rejected. So if you're coming into the process with some sort of skewed idea that you're going to, quote, hold people accountable to your personal vision of what the ideal made in a laboratory conservative is, with no regard whatsoever to whether or not that translates to winning elections or securing policy, then you're on the wrong track, you're on a different mission, and you're betraying your oath that you take when you come into caucus, which says you're going to work to elect Republicans.
By the way, the Republican caucus this time around has had no defections, no flaking away. I couldn't be happier about this. Is not your grandfather's Minnesota GOP.
Correct.
Walter Hudson, we got to spend an hour talking about this one of these days when you have some time. Thanks for coming by.
Absolutely.
I'm sure more up next. Go nowhere. Northern Alliance. Be right back.